Well, today, as we begin our time, I want to kind of kick off our time together by proposing a question to you. And the question that I want to propose is simply this: have you ever been your own worst enemy? Have you ever been your own worst enemy? Now, of course, there are going to come times in your life where you would probably say, yes, there are seasons, or yes, there are events that I've been my own worst enemy. And for me, this was very evident when I entered into my freshman year of college, because during high school, middle school, elementary school, school had always come very easily to me. I could study a little bit and I could still get good grades, and I felt really accomplished when I graduated high school without ever having a single C on any report card. I felt very accomplished, and it was really good because not only in my eyes, but also in the eyes of my father, who always pushed me to do the very best that I could. But when I got to my freshman year of college, I quickly discovered that that wasn't going to be the case. Because as I went through this, and even though my parents had always been satisfied with my academic progress, and so had I, my freshman year of college would reveal something else. Because during the second semester, I was required to take a course entitled Foundations in Christian Thought. And in this particular course, we examined different kind of denominations within Christianity, and also investigated different belief systems, different religions throughout the world. And I have to be honest with you, the content wasn't really that great at the time, or I didn't think it was that relevant. I wish I would have paid more attention to the class. But needless to say, at the end of that course, at the end of the second semester of my freshman year, I looked at my transcript that was still sent home to my parents, and I had my first C. And it really caused an issue within me, and it caused some anxiety within me and also within my parents. And then my sophomore year, the struggles continued as I had to take Greek because I was a Bible or a ministry major. And so because of that, we were required to take Greek. And anybody who's ever studied a dead language understands the dynamic and the difficulty that goes into that. And so I struggled greatly with that. And I earned a C my first semester and my second semester in Greek as well. And as I went through this, my transcripts would be sent home, my parents would get them, and my dad, although he never said anything, I could kind of tell that he was disappointed in me because of his quiet demeanor. And so what happened is I began to push myself harder. I began to really try to excel academically. And so I spent more time studying. I forewent several other activities that I could be doing. And I spent my time studying diligently to get the best grades that I could. And I'm proud to say today that even though I had those 3 C's during college, ever since then, including my master's, almost finishing my PhD right now, I've never received anything less than a B+ since. That I've tried to push myself and excel academically. Because here's the thing, I thought that that was gonna make me happy. I thought that that was pushing me to be a better person. But what I discovered is that while I was succeeding academically, I was actually becoming my own worst enemy. Because what I was doing is I was putting extra pressure on myself. I was causing extra anxiety within me. And maybe some of you can relate to that struggle, or maybe a struggle similar to that today, because you know somebody that has become their own worst enemy. Maybe it's in regards to their marriage, their career, their finances, their relationship with somebody else, or maybe their relationship with their children. And here's the thing, is we kind of see this unfolding in the lives of other people, don't we? We see this unfolding, and we know, I kind of feel like we should step in and say something, but we either can't or we don't. And it's easy for us in those moments when we look at the lives of other people to kind of become judgmental or become critical of those people, because we say, well, they've messed up such a large portion of their lives. And surely we would never do anything like that ourselves. But I want to let you know that I firmly believe that all of us have the potential to become our own worst enemy. And you may say, well, why are you so sure of that we all have the potential to become our own worst enemy? And the reason is simply this. And the reason that I know this to be true is because you have participated in all your bad decisions. You have participated in all your bad decisions. I mean, think about this. You were the mastermind behind all of your bad decisions, weren't you? If you go back through history, you were the mastermind behind all of your bad decisions. And this is a big deal because a single bad decision is always the first step towards becoming your own worst enemy. A single bad decision is always the first step towards becoming your own worst enemy. And we know this to be true because think about this. Every habit begins with a first time. Every habit begins with a first time. And so through this series, what I want to do is I want to kind of give you 3 things that you can begin doing that will help ensure that you will not become your own worst enemy. Now, the interesting thing is that Jesus never used this terminology, but in his most famous parable in the Sermon on the Mount that comes from Matthew chapter 5 to 7, specifically in Matthew chapter 7, he tells us that anyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a man who became his own worst enemy because he built his house on the sand. And we know that story, that Jesus talks about the man who built his house on the sand, and when the storm came, it destroyed everything. But the man who built his house on the rock, his house withstood. And when the man who built his house on the sand, when the storm hit and everything was destroyed, there was nobody to blame but himself because of the poor foundation of his house. And so in this series, what I want to do is I kind of want to present 3 habits that I want to call preemptive habits. And these preemptive habits are to help us to overcome the enemy within. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to unpack the first habit. And then we're going to add one on each week. So we'll end up with 3 at the end of this 3-week series. So the first preemptive habit that we must begin to practice is this, is to pay attention to the tension. Pay attention to the tension. You see, whenever you're considering any decision or any choice that comes your way, you need to pay attention to the tension. And as you pay attention to the tension, in those moments, you need to become very cautious. You need to become very cautious, and you could say it this way: don't start selling yourself. Don't start selling yourself, but instead start listening. Start listening. And we understand this, don't we? Because when we see something that we want, what do? We tend to try to sell ourselves on an idea. And we do these sales pitches in our minds, even if it's not the best idea for us. And in these moments, what do? We lie to ourselves, we deceive ourselves, and we become our own worst enemies because we begin to believe our own lies. I mean, think about it this way, that if a salesperson came up to you and gave you this sales pitch, and we're going to give you a few examples here in a moment, you would be really offended. In fact, you would probably walk out of the store and say, there's absolutely no way I would ever do business with them. But we do the same thing to ourselves. We use these sales pitches on ourselves, and we become our own worst enemy. Let me give you a few examples of this today. If somebody came up to you and said, if you get home and you decide you don't like it, just donate it. If you get home and you decide you don't like it, just donate it. I mean, if somebody told us that in some kind of business transaction, we would say there's no way that I would ever do business with them. But we do that to ourselves all the time, don't we? We purchase something and then we get home and we go, I just don't like that. I don't care for it, so I'm just going to donate it. Or what about this? I see that you already have one that does everything that you possibly need. But this one, well, it's newer. Yeah, you have one that's like it and it does everything that you already need, but this one, well, it's newer. And so we sell ourselves on the fact that we need this newer item. Or what about this? Well, yeah, it's wrong and we know it's wrong, but if we don't tell anyone, is it really wrong? You see, if somebody told us that in a business transaction, we'd ignore it completely and walk out of the store, but we lie to ourselves, we deceive ourselves, and we tell ourselves these things. Or what about this one? Sure, your husband would be hurt and offended if he found out, but, well, he's not really bright enough to find out, so go ahead and do it anyway. Or what about this one? Yes, your girlfriend would be devastated, but let's face it, she's not nearly as attractive as, and you can fill in the blank. I mean, we would be offended if we heard these things, right? If somebody used these on us, if somebody came to us and gave us these sales pitches, we would be offended. But we tell these narratives to ourselves. And that's the focus of where we're going to go next week. You see, if somebody actually said these things to us, we would say, well, I'm so offended. We would leave the store and refuse to ever do business with them again. But when we do it to ourselves, we can start selling ourselves on a bad idea. And so we need to pay attention to the tension. We need to pay attention to the tension. And you could say it this way, that the moment that you start selling yourself, you should hit pause. The moment that you start selling yourself, you should hit pause. Because when we start selling ourselves on an idea, we need to hit the pause button and we need to identify what is it that we're really doing. Because we need to understand this, and this is so incredibly powerful, but we rarely have to sell ourselves on a good idea. We rarely have to sell ourselves on a good idea. Now, there's a fascinating piece in the Hebrew Bible of what we as Christians call our Old Testament. And if you grew up in church for any length of time, chances are you've probably heard this narrative, you've heard this story before, but it's so important for us today because of where we're going to go. Now, the story today that we're going to look at, it revolves around King David. King David, who was Israel's second king. But this story actually began before David became king. The story actually began before David became king. And David is introduced to us on the pages of history as a shepherd boy who was thrown into the spotlight, because you may remember, David was like the first, even before Christ version of Uber Eats or Grubhub or DoorDash, because he brings his brothers lunch as they're on the battlefield with the Philistines. And as David approaches, here's what happens as he sees this mammoth of a Philistine named Goliath, who's taunting not only the entire army, but also the God of Israel. And so David listens to this and he becomes so aggravated and so irritated that he decides to take, things into his own hands. And so what does he do? He gets his slingshot, he gets a few rocks, and he goes out and he shoots the first one, and it hits Goliath square in the head and kills him immediately. But that's not enough for David, and so he goes and he chops off the head of this Philistine giant. And he takes it to the king. And he becomes an overnight sensation because of his actions. You see, David was willing to identify the problem. He was willing to look at this, even though he was just a lowly shepherd boy who was bringing lunch to his brothers. He saw that Goliath was taunting the armies of the Lord. And he basically understood that God simply needed a volunteer. And so David said, hey, I'll do it. And he stepped up and he took out Goliath. Now, after this exchange, King Saul, who was the first king of the nation of Israel, he knew that he had to keep David close. Because David was in the spotlight, and as king, he knew that there was the chance that David could overthrow him. So what did he do? He pulls him in close. He keeps somebody who's in the spotlight close to him so that there's less of a threat. And Saul gives David prominence with the military. He continues on, he says that's not enough. And so he marries off one of his daughters to David. So now David is Saul's son-in-law. The king is now his father-in-law. But David's popularity continues to grow. And Saul realizes David is now a threat to the throne, to his legacy, to his entire life. And so all of this is happening. But what we need to remember is that David had already been anointed at this point as the next king of Israel. David had already been anointed. It was already set in motion. And as a result of David's popularity growing and David already being anointed as king, Saul decides, hey, I'm going to use my daughter to manipulate David. And so I'm going to use her to manipulate him. And that plan didn't work. And then he decides, well, I'm going to use this, kind of method to get him killed. And that didn't work. And so what does he do is he says, okay, those two things didn't work. So then he sends him out to fight the Philistines, believing, that the Philistine army would continue to grow and continue to be a threat. And so because of that, David would eventually be killed. But David succeeds in every aspect that Saul threw at him. And as a result, he grows in popularity. And so it becomes Saul's permanent quest to kill David. And so David flees the city for the sake of his own life. He becomes an outlaw. He knows that he can't go home because that was going to put his family in danger. And so he makes several bad decisions, and eventually David becomes this outlaw. And as he's out, on the edges of the city trying to survive, he still has his fame. He still has his popularity. He still has his reputation. And so all these other outlaws begin to hear this, and they begin to flock to David. And David kind of becomes their leader, and they become this small army. And while this is taking place, Saul is still back running the kingdom, but he's constantly looking out for David. He's constantly sending out people to find David so that he can take him out. And this is all because Saul wanted to eliminate David so that Saul's son Jonathan could become the next king. And so one day Saul gets a report from one of his spies, one of the people that's out looking for David, and they say, hey, we found David and we found his men in the region of En-Gedi. And that's still accessible today if you visit Jerusalem. And so this area is really a barren wasteland. There's a few oases that are sprinkled in, but mainly this area is full of caves that border the Dead Sea. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 2, we pick up the story for today, and here's what it says. It says, so Saul took 3,000 men selected from all of Israel and went to look for David and his soldiers near the rocks of the wild goats. Now here's the thing. This was way more men than Saul needed. Way more men than Saul needed. He takes 3,000 men. And it's way more men than he would need to execute his plan. But Saul wanted to be careful because he knew that David had this amazing ability as a skilled warrior. And so the first part of verse 3 of 1 Samuel 24 says this. It says, he came to the sheep pens beside the road where there was a cave. And Saul went into the cave to use the restroom. Now, this may seem like a weird part of the story, and you're kind of like, why did they choose to put that in there? But it's important to understand why the author included it. So this caravan of 3,000 men is walking to find David and a few outlaws. And Saul has to stop and go to the bathroom. And so what does he do? He halts the entire caravan. He goes into the cave, and everybody out there is forced to wait, which sets up a major twist in the story because the second half of verse 3 reads this way. Meanwhile, David and his soldiers were sitting in the very back of the cave. So what are the odds of this, right? That Saul and his 3,000 men come looking for David, and David and his men are in the very cave that Saul chooses to go into and go to the bathroom in. I mean, for David, this is a best case scenario, right? It's an answer to prayer because he sees Saul coming in. He knows that his men are scattered all over in these different caves, and the thought that, hey, we could later reconvene, it's kind of like they hear that Saul's coming, and so they all go into these different caves and hide and thinking, hey, later we'll reconvene and we'll, kind of travel our own way, go the opposite way to ensure our safety. But David is in this cave that Saul comes into, and David's been in here for a while, so his eyes have already adjusted to the light setting of the cave. And all of this happens, but when Saul walks in, he's been out in the bright sun, and so he can't see immediately. And in this moment, it's almost as if David could think God had delivered his enemy into his hand. God had delivered his enemy into his hands. Now, we can assume that that's what was running through David's mind, right? Because and actually, here's the thing, is we don't even have to assume it because the text actually tells us what David's men were whispering in his ear as they're in the back of the cave. Because in the first part of verse 4, it says, David's soldiers said to him, this is the day the Lord spoke of, when he promised you, I will hand your enemy over to you, and you can do to him whatever you think best. You see, this is what David had told his men repeatedly as they were sitting around the campfire each night. And the men were excited because to them, it was like, hey, now the waiting was over. Now the waiting was over. And so they were excited because here was this moment. They no longer had to be outlaws. They were ready for David to become king because they already knew that he had been anointed king. And they were like, this is the moment, because if he gets anointed king, then we can return home and we'll no longer be outlaws. But instead, something different happens. And I want you just to imagine for a moment that you're one of the 3,000 soldiers that's outside of the cave. You're waiting on Saul, and you see Saul enter the cave, but then suddenly you watch somebody else come out holding Saul's head, and you see it's David, this great and skillful warrior. I mean, if that had happened in that moment, everyone in the caravan would have had no choice but to recognize David as the king of Israel. There would have been no civil war. There would have been very little bloodshed. Their lives would have been spared. I mean, can you kind of imagine the buildup of the emotion that was going on in that cave that day? I mean, we can't even begin to imagine the pressure that David had to feel to act, to do something in the cave that day. But as the story unfolds, here's what we're told, is that David felt something else as well. Now there was a tension that didn't make any sense. And so in verse 4, it says, so David snuck up. So David snuck up. And it's kind of like this. So as David moves closer to Saul, the tension that he's feeling is intensified. And somehow, as this emotion and as this tension is building, David is able to stop. He's able to hit the pause button. He's able to pay attention to the tension that he was feeling. And somehow, as he was sneaking up behind Saul, his desire to kill him was changed. It was completely reframed. And David realized in this moment, I'm about to murder the king. David realized, I'm about to murder the king. He realized that he couldn't erase, he couldn't do anything to what God had put in place. And so you could say it this way, that David was conscience stricken. David was conscience stricken in this moment. And because David had listened to the tension, it saved him from becoming his own worst enemy. It saved him from becoming his own worst enemy. And instead of killing Saul, David took Saul's discarded robe while he was going to the bathroom aside, and he cut off a portion of it. He cut off a corner of it. And then he tosses the robe back and he sneaks back to the corner of the cave. Now we can only imagine what was going through the minds of his men as he returns back to the back of the cave, not with Saul's head and bloodshed, but instead he returns back with the corner of what was his discarded robe while he was going to the bathroom. And in verse 6 of 1 Samuel 24, it says, the Lord forbid, he told his men, that I should do something like that to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, because he's the Lord's anointed. Now, David's men, they listen to him for a second, but then they're like, okay, listen, David, you don't want to take matters into your own hands. That's great. We'll do it for you. We'll handle the issue before you. We'll take out Saul. But in verse 7, it says, so David held his soldiers in check by what he said, and he wouldn't allow them to attack Saul. Saul then left the cave and went on his way. Now, let me ask you a question. And then we'll get back to the story. Are you close? Are you close? Are you contemplating something? Are you selling yourself on an idea that you know there's no way that you're wrong? I mean, you've got this idea in your mind. You're like, there's no way that I'm possibly wrong. Are you close? Are you selling yourself on an idea? And maybe you've been lying to so many people for so long that you say, there's no possible way that I can be honest with myself now. And so kind of the root question at the bottom of all of this is, are you selling yourself on a bad idea? Are you selling yourself on a bad idea? Are you on the verge of listening to the enemy within? If that's you today, if you're selling yourself on a bad idea and you're on the verge of becoming your own worst enemy, here's what I would encourage you to do today. Hit pause. Stop selling and start listening. Hit pause. Stop selling and start listening. You see, are you willing to listen to the voices around you? Because maybe some other people are kind of giving you advice and they're speaking into that, even though, there are times that we know we should, but yet we can't or we don't. But maybe you're willing to listen to that still small voice inside of you, that may be the whisper of the voice of God, who loves you, who desires to keep you from becoming your own worst enemy. You see, the text tells us that Saul actually exits the cave. He's unaware how close he was to death. He goes back to his mule and he tells the men, okay, it's time to move on. And as they start to head out, Saul hears this voice behind him, and it's a very familiar voice to him. And all of a sudden, everybody turns back and they look to the cave that Saul just left. And there stands David with his men. Now, it's interesting to see how David responds, because he bows low in honor. He bows low in honor to the king before he stands up and he holds up the corner of the robe that he had just cut off in the cave. And in that moment, everyone knew who the better man was. In that moment, everyone knew who the better man was, which it wasn't Saul, it was David. And David proceeds to give a little speech, and at the very end of this speech, David makes a statement. And in verse 12 of 1 Samuel 24, he says, may the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord take vengeance on you for me, but I won't lift a hand against you. You see, David tells them, hey, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm not going to take matters into my own hands. In other words, you could say it this way, that David decided not to use Saul's bad behavior as an excuse for bad behavior. David decided not to use Saul's bad behavior as an excuse for bad behavior. Now let's make this personal today. What about you? What about the option that you're considering? Are you considering becoming like a person that you don't even like? Are you considering becoming like a person you don't even like? Remember, we rarely have to sell ourselves on the right thing to do. We rarely have to sell ourselves on the right thing to do. And so in this moment in the story, all eyes have now turned and focused on David. They've listened to what David said. And after they've taken this all in, they turn and they look back at Saul, and they realize that Saul has completely and totally been humiliated by David. He's not humiliated by David's military skill. He's humiliated by David's character and self-control. In fact, you could say it this way, that Saul is humiliated by David's humility. Saul is humiliated by David's humility. And so Saul has no choice in this moment. He's like, yeah, David, you're the better man. And so he turns around, he heads back home towards Jerusalem. You see, this is the power of paying attention to the tension. You see, the tension that you're wrestling with right now and some decision that you're seeking to make, it probably falls somewhere between incredibly insignificant and murdering a king. Chances are it falls somewhere in the middle, between incredibly insignificant and murdering a king. But yet the principle is the same. Because if there's something that you can't quite put a finger on, then maybe you need to press the pause button. And if there's something that someone else has identified, here's what I would encourage. If somebody else is speaking some truth into your life and they've identified this in your life, let it bother you. Let it bother you. Because this tension may be God's way of protecting you from becoming your own worst enemy. Now, this may be painful, but I promise you that if you listen to that tension, if you pay attention to the tension, the curtain will open up and you will have greater clarity about your situation. So it's in these moments that we need to ask ourselves, is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? And this is a preemptive strike against falling victim to the enemy within. In fact, you could say it this way, that every habit begins with a first time. Every pattern begins with a first line. Every journey begins with a first step. Every habit begins with a first time. Every pattern begins with a first line. Every journey begins with a first step. And it's in these moments that we need to let that tension bother us. We need to let that tension bother us. We need to face it until it goes away or until we determine that we can go a different way. You see, what starts as an uneasy feeling, it eventually becomes supported with reason and insight. And so what I'd like for you to do today is I'd like for you to consider making a commitment to the first of these three ideas that we're going to present throughout this series. So the first one is simply this, is that I will pause until I pinpoint the cause. I will pause until I pinpoint the cause. I will explore rather than ignore my conscience. That I'll pay attention to the tension because that is a decision that I will never regret. And that's a decision that will lead me to far fewer regrets in my life. You see, this will be a decision, when we pay attention to the tension, this will be a decision that will keep us from falling victim to the enemy within. Let me pray for you today. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for who you are, and we thank you for this amazing story that's been preserved in our Old Testament. The story of David and his faithfulness, of how he was willing to say no, that I won't let someone else's bad behavior direct my steps. That even in the moment when he could have seized it and he could have been guided to do something wrong, instead he said no, and he paid attention to the tension. He hit the pause button. He stopped selling himself on a bad idea, and he started listening to your voice. And so God, would you just help us to do that today? That in the decisions that we're facing, that we would hit the pause button, that we would stop trying to sell ourselves on a bad idea, because rarely do we have to sell ourselves on a good idea. And that we would start listening to your voice. That we would hit the pause button until we identify the cause. God, we pray that you would lead us and guide us and direct us in this week as we pay attention to the tension in our lives. Jesus, we thank you, we love you, and we ask all these things in your name. Amen. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, it's been a privilege and an honor to share these thoughts with you as we move through this series of overcoming the enemy within. Next week, we're going to jump into part number 2 of this series, and we're going to give you the second preemptive habit to help you overcome the enemy within. So we invite you to join us next week for part number 2. And this week, as you navigate, remember to pay attention to the tension when it comes to the decisions in your life. Have a great and wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you back here next week.